In the blink of an eye, a mother's world shattered beyond recognition. September 1983. Deborah Matthews rushed her sick daughter to St. Mary's Children's Hospital, her identical triplets only 6 years old. When she turned back from the examination room, 2 of her daughters had vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no evidence, nothing but empty space where 2 little girls in red overalls should have been. For 20 agonizing years, Deborah carried the weight of their absence, enduring suspicious whispers from neighbors and the slow destruction of her relationship with her remaining daughter. But when construction workers demolished the old hospital in 2003, they unearthed a small metal box containing a child's bracelet and bone fragments, evidence deliberately preserved as if someone wanted it to be found. What begins as closure spirals into a nightmare beyond imagination, as Deborah discovers her daughters weren't just taken, they were selected. What happens when a mother's 20-year search for the truth leads to answers far more devastating than the questions? Follow this heart-wrenching journey as Deborah uncovers the dark conspiracy behind her daughter's disappearance and confronts the haunting question: what would you do if you found your missing children only to discover they no longer know who you are? Subscribe now, like this video, and comment where you're watching from to join us for this emotional story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, identity, and the lengths someone will go to uncover buried truths. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Children's Hospital flickered against the September chill of 1983, casting eerie shadows across the nearly empty parking lot in Asheville, North Carolina. The wind howled through the autumn trees, as if nature itself was trying to warn of the impending tragedy. Deborah Matthews, a single mother with tired eyes and calloused hands from working double shifts at the local diner, rushed toward the emergency entrance. In her arms, she cradled 6-year-old Emily, whose tiny body convulsed uncontrollably, her blonde curls matted with sweat against her feverish forehead. "Hold on, baby girl, we're almost there," Deborah whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Behind her, Emily's identical sisters, Sarah and Claire, struggled to keep pace, their matching red corduroy overalls and white turtlenecks making them look like little dolls come to life. They clutched each other's hands tightly, their wide blue eyes reflecting the terror of seeing their sister in pain. "Mommy, is Emmy gonna die?" Sarah whispered, tugging at the hem of Deborah's worn denim jacket. "No, sweetheart," Deborah answered, not breaking stride. "The doctors will make her better. Just stay close." The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, welcoming them into a chaotic scene. The emergency room buzzed with frantic energy, phones ringing incessantly, nurses rushing between curtained beds, the antiseptic smell mixing with the metallic scent of blood from a car accident victim who had just been wheeled in. "Please, my daughter needs help," Deborah called out, her voice nearly drowned by the cacophony of hospital sounds. A nurse with deep circles under her eyes glanced up from her clipboard. "What's happening with her?" "She's having seizures. It's her 3rd one tonight. She's burning up," Deborah explained, as Emily's body went rigid in her arms. The little girl's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, her lips taking on a bluish tinge. "Get Dr. Hoffman, stat," the nurse called out, quickly taking Emily from Deborah's trembling arms and placing her on a gurney. "Has this happened before?" "Never like this," Deborah answered, her heart pounding in her chest. As the medical team swarmed around Emily, Deborah suddenly remembered her other daughters. She turned back to find Sarah and Claire standing wide-eyed in the middle of the hallway, clutching each other, looking terrified and out of place amid the rush of adults. "Girls, come sit over here," Deborah called, motioning to a wooden bench that sat against the wall near the nurse's station. "I need to stay with Emmy for just a minute. Don't move from this spot, understand?" The twins nodded in unison, their blonde pigtails bobbing. Claire's lip trembled as she whispered, "Promise you'll come back?" The innocence of the question pierced Deborah's heart. "Of course I will. I'll be right there in that room. Just be good girls and wait here." As Sarah and Claire settled onto the bench, Deborah noticed a strange man in a white coat watching them from down the hallway. Something about his gaze made her uneasy, but the nurse was calling for her. "Ms. Matthews, we need to know what medications she's on." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur as Deborah answered questions, signed forms, and held Emily's hand while the doctors stabilized her. When Dr. Roberts finally announced that Emily's fever was coming down and the seizures appeared to be subsiding, Deborah felt her legs nearly give out with relief. "We'll need to keep her overnight for observation," the doctor explained. She's responding well to the medication, but we want to run some tests in the morning to make sure this isn't something more serious. Deborah nodded, stroking Emily's damp hair. Thank you. I just need to check on my other daughters. They're waiting in the hall. With a grateful smile to the medical team, she stepped out of the treatment room and looked toward the wooden bench where she had left Sarah and Claire. The bench was empty. Girls? Deborah called, her voice echoing slightly in the corridor. No response. Sarah? Claire? Her voice rose an octave, panic beginning to gnaw at her chest. A janitor pushing a mop bucket paused. You looking for someone, ma'am? My daughters. Twin girls, 6 years old, blonde hair, red overalls. They were sitting right there. She pointed at the empty bench, her hand shaking. The janitor shook his head. Haven't seen any kids, sorry. Deborah's walk became a run as she checked the nearby waiting room, the bathrooms, the vending machine area. With each empty space, the knot in her stomach tightened. Her daughters weren't playing hide and seek. Something was terribly wrong. My daughters are missing, she screamed, running back to the nurse's station. Please, someone help me find them. The night shift security guard was called. Then the hospital was locked down. Then the local police arrived. Officers spread throughout the building, checking every closet, every room, every stairwell. Security footage revealed a disturbing truth. The cameras near the emergency entrance had mysteriously stopped working for exactly 7 minutes, the precise window when the girls had vanished. By dawn, Deborah sat hollow-eyed beside Emily's hospital bed, staring at the wall as detectives peppered her with questions she couldn't answer. Ms. Matthews, is there anyone who might want to hurt you or your family? Detective Simmons asked, his voice gentle but probing. Deborah shook her head numbly. We don't have anyone. It's just us four since their father left. And the girl's father? Where is he now? California, I think. He hasn't seen them since they were babies. Tears slid down her cheeks. They were right there. I only took my eyes off them for minutes. As morning light spilled through the hospital windows, Emily stirred in her bed. Her fever had broken, but she seemed disoriented, confused about why her mother was crying, why men in uniforms were standing in her room. Mommy? Emily's voice was small, fragile. Where are Sarah and Claire? Deborah couldn't answer. How could she tell her 6-year-old daughter that her sisters had vanished without a trace? Emily's tiny fingers clutched her mother's hand, her eyes suddenly distant, as if seeing something no one else could see. Mommy, don't let them take me too, she whispered. The words sent a chill down Deborah's spine. What do you mean, baby? Did you see something? Who took your sisters? But Emily had already drifted back to sleep, the medication pulling her under before she could answer. Outside the room, the hospital buzzed with activity. Staff were being questioned, security measures scrutinized. News vans began gathering in the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. By nightfall, the faces of Sarah and Claire Matthews would be on every television screen in North Carolina. In the coming days, the entire city of Asheville would be caught in the grip of the mystery. How could 2 little girls vanish from a busy hospital without anyone seeing anything? Theories spread like wildfire. Kidnapping, trafficking, even supernatural explanations. For Deborah Matthews, none of it mattered. As she sat beside Emily's hospital bed, clutching the one daughter she had left, she was haunted by one devastating truth. She had promised to come back, and in those few minutes of absence, her world had shattered beyond repair. The twins' red overalls and white turtlenecks were found 3 days later, carefully folded in a maintenance closet on the hospital's lowest level. But Sarah and Claire had vanished without a trace, as if they had never existed at all. 20 years could change a landscape, a town, a face, but grief had its own timeline. For Deborah Matthews, 2 decades had passed like a slow-motion nightmare, each morning bringing the same crushing realization. Her daughters were still gone. September 2003 arrived with the same cruel wind that had swept through Asheville on that fateful night 20 years earlier. The maple trees along Cherry Street had turned the same fiery orange, a beauty Deborah could no longer appreciate. At 49, her once vibrant blonde hair had faded to a dull gray with deep lines etched around eyes that rarely found reason to smile. She moved like a ghost through her own life, present, but never truly there. The small clapboard house she rented on the outskirts of town was a shrine to absence. In the cramped living room, 3 identical porcelain ballerinas collected dust on the mantel, birthday gifts the twins never received. A faded photograph hung crooked on the wall. 3 identical 6-year-old girls with gap-toothed smiles. taken just weeks before the hospital visit that destroyed everything. "Morning, Mrs. Cahill," Deborah mumbled, nodding to her elderly neighbor as she shuffled down the cracked sidewalk toward the bus stop. Mrs. Cahill nodded back stiffly, but her eyes held the same mixture of pity and suspicion that Deborah had endured for 20 years. The whispers had never truly stopped. Some in town still believed Deborah had something to do with the disappearance, a theory fueled by the local newspaper's aggressive coverage during those early months. "Mother's story doesn't add up," one headline had screamed. Others speculated that she had sold her children, or that the girls had been taken by their father in an elaborate custody scheme. The truth, that 2 children had simply vanished from a busy hospital without a trace, seemed too impossible to accept. The Blue Ridge laundromat had been Deborah's workplace for 16 years now. The rhythmic hum of the industrial washing machines, the chemical smell of detergent, and the predictable routine provided the only stability in her fractured life. She kept her head down, sorted the white uniforms from the colored ones, and avoided conversation beyond what was necessary. "That influenza outbreak at the retirement home has these sheets coming in by the truckload," her manager Betty commented, wheeling in another cart of soiled linens. Deborah nodded, her hands continuing their mechanical sorting. The irony wasn't lost on her. Now she cleaned the sheets from St. Mary's Medical Center, the very place where her daughters had vanished. The hospital had been renamed after a corporate takeover in the late 90s, but the ghosts remained the same. Emily, her only remaining daughter, had left Asheville the day after her 18th birthday. She couldn't bear the weight of being the surviving triplet, the girl whose seizure had inadvertently led to her sister's disappearance. Their relationship had fractured under the strain of unspoken accusations and overwhelming survivor's guilt. Emily now lived in Seattle, calling only on Christmas and birthdays, her voice always tight with things unsaid. "You still going to that support group tonight?" Betty asked, breaking into Deborah's thoughts. Deborah's hands faltered on the sheets. The missing children's parents support group met every Thursday evening at the community center. She had attended faithfully for nearly 10 years before finally giving up. The others in the group had eventually found answers, some heartbreaking, some hopeful. But Deborah's case remained the only one completely unresolved. No bodies, no ransom, no sightings, nothing. "No," she replied quietly. "Not anymore." The afternoon passed in a blur of laundry carts and folding tables. By 5 o'clock, Deborah's back ached from leaning over the industrial folding station. As she punched her time card, the ancient telephone mounted on the wall beside the manager's office rang shrilly. "Matthews? Call for you?" Betty called, holding out the receiver with an odd expression on her face. Deborah frowned. Nobody ever called her at work. Emily always used her home number, and she had no other family or friends to speak of. "This is Deborah," she said cautiously into the receiver. "Ms. Matthews," a deep male voice, unfamiliar yet official. "This is Detective James Wilson from the Asheville Police Department Cold Case Division." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Cold case. Those words had lost their power to inspire hope years ago. Now they only dredged up the painful cycle of raised expectations, followed by crushing disappointment. "What is it?" she asked flatly. "There's been a development in your daughter's case." His voice was careful, measured. "The old saint. Mary's Children's Hospital is being demolished this week to make way for a new medical complex." Deborah knew this. Everyone in town did. The implosion had been featured in the local paper for weeks. During the preliminary excavation behind the hospital grounds, the construction crew discovered something, Wilson continued. "I believe it's something you need to see in person." Her free hand gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles turning white. "Tell me," she demanded. "Ms. Matthews, I prefer not to discuss this over the phone. Would you be able to meet me at the construction site tomorrow morning at 9? 20 years of police interviews and false leads had taught Deborah not to hope, not to imagine that this call might be different from all the others. Yet something in the detective's careful tone cut through her practiced numbness. "They found remains, didn't they?" she whispered. A long pause. "Ms. Matthews, all I can say is that we found something that may be connected to your daughter's disappearance. Something you need to see." After hanging up, Deborah stood motionless in the laundromat's harsh fluorescent lighting. Betty watched her with concerned eyes but knew better than to ask questions. The weight of 20 years of silence pressed down on Deborah's shoulders as she gathered her worn purse and threadbare jacket. Outside, the September wind had picked up, sending candy wrappers and dead leaves skittering along the sidewalk. Deborah didn't wait for the bus. Instead, she walked the 3 miles home, her mind replaying the detective's words. With each step, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her grief began to crack. Tomorrow might finally bring answers, but after 20 years of unanswered questions, Deborah wasn't sure she could survive the truth. Dawn broke over Asheville with a reluctant, watery light that barely penetrated the fog hanging low over the mountains. Deborah had been awake for hours, her body curled in the same armchair where she'd spent countless nights during the first year after the disappearance, waiting for a phone call that never came. She had chosen her clothes carefully, a simple navy dress she hadn't worn in years, as if meeting with the detective required some form of ceremony. Her hands trembled as she fastened a silver locket around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she still wore. Inside were 3 identical locks of blonde hair, snipped on the triplets' 6th birthday, just 2 months before Sarah and Claire vanished. The demolition site that had once been St. Mary's Children's Hospital loomed against the morning sky like a wounded giant. The once pristine white building was now partially gutted, with exposed steel beams and broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the September breeze, keeping onlookers at bay. "Ms. Matthews?" A tall man in a charcoal suit approached as Deborah stepped out of her taxi. Detective James Wilson was younger than she had expected, probably in his mid-30s, with kind eyes that hadn't yet been hardened by decades of unsolved cases. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Deborah nodded, her eyes fixed on the hospital ruins. "This place has haunted my dreams for 20 years, she said quietly. "Never thought I'd be standing here again." The detective gestured toward a makeshift path that led around the crumbling structure. "We'll need to go to the back of the property. The excavation team has secured the area." They walked in silence, their shoes crunching on gravel and broken concrete. Behind the main building, where a staff parking lot had once been, several construction vehicles sat idle. A section had been cordoned off with additional police tape, and a small blue tent had been erected over what appeared to be a shallow pit. 2 uniformed officers nodded respectfully as Wilson led Deborah toward the tent. A woman in a white lab coat knelt inside, carefully brushing dirt from something Deborah couldn't yet see. "Dr. Lambert is with our forensics team," Wilson explained. "She's been documenting everything exactly as we found it." The forensic specialist rose and stepped aside, allowing Deborah her first glimpse into the excavation. The morning light caught on something metallic at the bottom of the shallow hole, a rusted metal box about the size of a shoebox, its lid pried open. "One of the construction workers hit this with an excavator yesterday afternoon," Wilson explained. "It was buried approximately 4 feet underground, in what would have been just outside the hospital's old maintenance area." Deborah's legs suddenly felt weak. Wilson gently guided her to a folding chair someone had placed nearby. "What's inside?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wilson exchanged a glance with Dr. Lambert, who nodded and carefully lifted a small evidence bag from a table inside the tent. She handed it to the detective, who in turn held it out for Deborah to see. Inside the clear plastic bag was a small pink bracelet, discolored with age but unmistakable in its design. Delicate pink plastic beads and a small silver-colored heart charm. Etched into the heart in childish lettering were the words, "Mommy, don't cry." The world around Deborah seemed to collapse. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry that rose from somewhere deep inside her chest, a sound of pure anguish that had been building for 20 years. "You recognize it," Wilson said. It wasn't a question. "I gave them each one," Deborah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "For Christmas 1982. They were so proud, wanted matching presents because they were identical girls with identical hearts." That's what Sarah said. Her fingers pressed against the plastic bag, trembling. This was Claire's. I can tell by the way she arranged the beads. Pink, white, pink, pink, white. Sarah's pattern was different. Emily's too. Wilson's face remained professional, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of compassion. "Ms. Matthews, I need to prepare you." The box contained other items besides the bracelet. Dr. Lambert approached with another evidence bag, larger this time. Deborah could see what looked like fragments of bone, yellowed with age, no larger than a child's finger. "These appear to be human remains," the forensic specialist explained gently. "Very small fragments. We'll need to conduct DNA testing to confirm identity, but given the size and condition, they belong to a child." Deborah finished, her voice hollow. The room seemed to spin around her. reality bending in ways she'd imagined 1,000 times but was never truly prepared for. "My child, my Claire." Several camera flashes suddenly burst from beyond the police tape. Deborah looked up to see a small crowd gathering at the perimeter. Among them, she recognized reporters from the local news stations. Word had traveled fast. "Ms. Matthews, we need to move you somewhere more private," Wilson said, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "The press shouldn't be here yet." But it was too late. The cameras had captured the moment. Deborah Matthews, the mother who'd carried 20 years of uncertainty, now on her knees in the mud, her face twisted in grief and shock. By nightfall, her image would be on every news channel in the state. As they helped her to a police vehicle, Deborah's mind raced with painful clarity. The carefully preserved bracelet, the meticulously collected bone fragments. This wasn't just a gruesome discovery. This was a message. Someone had deliberately buried these items here, preserved them like artifacts. "Detective?" she said, her voice suddenly stronger as she turned to Wilson. Someone wanted this to be found. This wasn't an accident. Wilson's expression changed subtly. "What makes you say that, Ms. Matthews?" "The box," Deborah said, her eyes clearing despite the tears. "It was metal, meant to protect what was inside. And the bracelet, it's almost perfectly preserved. Someone kept these things for years before burying them here. Why? And why now when they knew the hospital was being torn down?" For the first time, Wilson looked at Deborah not just as a victim's mother, but as someone with insight he hadn't considered. "That's a good question. One of many we need to answer." As the police car pulled away from the demolition site, Deborah looked back at the crumbling hospital, the place that had swallowed her daughters and spit back only fragments 20 years later. The weight of uncertainty had been replaced by something heavier, more terrible, the possibility that someone had been watching her all these years, waiting for the right moment to reveal just enough of the truth to break her all over again. The Asheville Police Department hadn't changed much in 20 years. The same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the interview room where Deborah now sat, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of bitter coffee that had long gone cold. The walls were still the same shade of institutional beige, though the cigarette smoke stains that had once yellowed the ceiling had faded after the building went smoke-free in the late 90s. Detective Wilson sat across from her, a digital recorder glowing red on the table between them. Beside him, a younger female detective named Martinez took notes in a spiral-bound pad, her pen moving quickly across the paper. "We've contacted every staff member from St. Mary's who still lives in the area," Wilson explained, sliding a folder toward Deborah. 15 have agreed to come in for interviews today. I thought you might want to be present for some of them." Deborah flipped through the list of names, a sharp pain lancing through her chest as she recognized several. Nurse Jenkins, who had been working the ER desk that night, Dr. Peterson, the physician who had treated Emily, Janitor Franklin, who had been the first person she'd asked about the missing twins. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Why are they willing to talk after all these years of silence?" Wilson exchanged a glance with his partner. The discovery has changed things. Some people who were reluctant before are feeling more cooperative with physical evidence on the table. "You mean now that they know they can't pretend it never happened?" Deborah said flatly. The first interview began 30 minutes later. Martha Jenkins had been a night shift nurse in 1983, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor who had testified during the original investigation that she'd seen nothing unusual that night. Now in her 70s, her once dark hair had turned snow white, but her sharp eyes hadn't softened with age. "I've thought about those girls every day for 20 years, Jenkins said, after the preliminaries were complete. "Every single day. Yet you never contacted me," Deborah said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Never once reached out to say you remembered something." Jenkins' gaze didn't waver, "Because what I remember doesn't make sense. It didn't then, and it doesn't now." Wilson leaned forward. "Mrs. Jenkins, please tell us exactly what you saw that night." The old nurse took a deep breath. "I was at the nurse's station when Deborah brought Emily in. Busy night, flu season was hitting early. I remember seeing the twins sitting on that bench while their mother went with Emily into exam room 3. She paused, her fingers nervously twisting a tissue. About 10 minutes later, I looked up and saw Dr. Hoffman walking down the hall with them. "Dr. Richard Hoffman?" Wilson clarified, making a note. "The pediatric surgeon?" "Yes," Jenkins nodded. "He had the girls by the hand, one on each side. I assumed he was taking them to the cafeteria or something. He was good with kids, always had lollipops in his pocket. Deborah's heart began to race. This detail had never been mentioned in the original investigation. You saw them leaving with a doctor and didn't think to mention this before? Jenkins' face tightened defensively. I did mention it. I told Detective Simmons the next day. He said Dr. Hoffman denied ever seeing the girls and that he'd been in surgery all evening. There were records to prove it. They made me feel like I was either lying or crazy, so I backed down. Wilson and Martinez exchanged a significant look. What happened to Dr. Hoffman? Deborah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He left Asheville about a year after the incident, Wilson replied, consulting his notes. Took a position at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He died in 1997, car accident. The next interview proved even more confusing. Thomas Franklin, the janitor who had been mopping the floors that night, now walked with a cane and breathed with the assistance of an oxygen tank. I didn't see who took them, he said, his voice raspy from decades of smoking. But around midnight, when the police were already searching the hospital, I heard something. His rheumy eyes looked directly at Deborah. Crying. Little girls crying. Coming from below. Below? Wilson pressed. The basement level, where the old boiler room was. Franklin leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. That hospital had all kinds of hidden areas. Service tunnels running between buildings. Storage spaces that weren't on any blueprint. Places where you could move around without being seen. Did you tell the police this at the time? Martinez asked. Franklin nodded vigorously. Course I did. Detective Simmons himself. He took me down there. We searched every inch. Nothing. He said I was hearing things. The old man tapped his temple. But I know what I heard. And I wasn't the only one. By late afternoon, Deborah's head was spinning with contradictions. A nurse who claimed to have seen the girls with a doctor who was supposedly in surgery. A janitor who heard crying from a basement that yielded nothing when searched. A security guard who insisted the surveillance system had been deliberately tampered with, not simply malfunctioning. None of this makes sense, she said to Wilson as they took a break between interviews. How could there be so many different stories about the same night? The detective handed her a fresh cup of coffee. People's memories are unreliable, especially after 20 years, but it's also possible that someone was covering things up. Deborah finished for him. The thought had been growing in her mind all day. Wilson nodded slowly. I've pulled the original case files. There are inconsistencies in Detective Simmons's reports. Witnesses whose statements were summarized rather than recorded verbatim. Evidence that was noted but never photographed. Where is Simmons now? Retired to Florida 10 years ago. Wilson hesitated. Ms. Matthews, there's something else. Something I found this morning when I was researching the hospital's history. He placed a yellowed newspaper clipping on the table. The headline read, St. Mary's launches Emergency Child Placement Program, 1979. In the late 70s and early 80s, St. Mary's ran what they called an emergency adoption initiative for children from families deemed unable to care for them, Wilson explained. Most of these were from very poor backgrounds, single mothers, situations where there was perceived neglect. Deborah stared at the article, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. You think my girls were taken as part of some adoption scheme? I don't know, Wilson admitted, but it's a lead worth pursuing. Unfortunately, most of the records from this program were reportedly destroyed in a fire at the hospital's administrative building in 1985. Deborah's hands began to shake. A convenient fire. Too convenient, Wilson agreed. We're trying to locate anyone who worked specifically with this program, but so far we've hit dead ends. Deborah stood abruptly, needing to move, to think. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but one with gaping holes and blurred edges. Why would anyone target her daughter specifically? She had been a struggling single mother, yes, but she'd never neglected her children. I need to see the records myself, she said suddenly. Not just what the police have. The hospital archives, the newspaper coverage from back then, everything. Wilson looked surprised. Ms. Matthews, we have officers assigned to— No, Deborah interrupted, her voice firm. For 20 years I trusted the police to find my daughters. Now I find out witnesses were ignored. Evidence was mishandled, and there was a whole program at that hospital that might explain why children were disappearing. I need to do this myself. For a long moment, Wilson studied her face. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. The department can't officially endorse a civilian investigation, but I can point you toward the public archives and maybe open a few doors that might otherwise stay closed. For the first time in 20 years, Deborah felt something other than grief or resignation. It was a dangerous feeling, one she had deliberately suppressed for so long. Hope, tinged with the cold steel of determination. "I'm going to find out what happened to my daughters," she said. All of them. The Asheville Public Library's basement archive smelled of dust and forgotten secrets. Yellow-tinged fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Deborah hunched over stacks of microfiche reels, her eyes burning from hours of scanning newspaper articles about St. Mary's Hospital. 3 days had passed since the discovery at the demolition site, and she had barely slept, driven by a desperate energy she hadn't felt in years. "Ms. Matthews?" A soft voice interrupted her concentration. Melissa Torres, a young journalist from the Asheville Chronicle, stood in the doorway clutching a leather messenger bag. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Deborah recognized the woman from the press conference Detective Wilson had arranged. While other reporters had shouted sensationalist questions, Torres had remained quiet, watchful, her dark eyes missing nothing. "I'm busy," Deborah said curtly, returning to the screen. "I think I can help you." Torres placed a manila folder on the table. "I've been investigating St. Mary's for over a year now, long before they found that box." This caught Deborah's attention. "Why?" "Because yours wasn't the only case." Torres slid into the chair opposite Deborah. "Between 1978 and 1985, 8 children disappeared from hospitals in western North Carolina, 3 from St. Mary's alone." Deborah's heart began to pound. "That can't be right. I would have known. The police would have connected the cases." Torres shook her head, her expression grim. "Not if someone didn't want them connected." "Look." She opened the folder, revealing photocopies of newspaper clippings. Jennifer Wyatt, age 4, vanished from St. Mary's while her mother was filling out insurance paperwork. 1981. Miguel Sanchez, age 7, disappeared from the children's ward during a fire alarm. 1979. She looked up, meeting Deborah's gaze. The pattern is there, but these cases were never linked. Each was treated as an isolated incident. Deborah's hands trembled as she flipped through the clippings. How had she never known? She remembered the months after the twins disappeared, how she'd scoured newspapers daily, desperate for any information. Yet these cases had never been mentioned in connection with her daughters. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "What do you want?" "The truth," Torres replied simply. "Just like you, but I can't get it alone. People won't talk to me. I'm just a reporter, but you..." Her voice softened. "You're the mother who never gave up. People will talk to you." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the hum of the microfiche reader. Finally, Deborah spoke. "Tell me what you know about the Emergency Child Placement Program." Torres's eyes widened slightly. "You've been doing your homework." She pulled out a notebook from her bag. "It started in 1978, supposedly to help children from at-risk environments. On paper, it was about providing temporary homes for kids whose parents couldn't care for them due to poverty, illness, or other hardships. But in reality? In reality, there are no records of where most of these children actually went." Torres leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the empty room. "I've interviewed former nurses who say children would be identified as candidates for the program, then suddenly transferred out of the hospital, often in the middle of the night. No paperwork, no follow-up." Deborah felt sick. "Are you suggesting my daughters were taken as part of this program?" "They weren't abandoned or neglected. I was right there in the hospital." "I don't know," Torres admitted, "but there's someone who might. Father Thomas Mackenzie was the hospital chaplain from 1975 to 1986. He would have been there the night your daughters disappeared." "Why haven't the police interviewed him?" "Because officially, he's been in a Catholic retirement home upstate for the past decade. Alzheimer's. But my sources tell me his condition is greatly exaggerated. He's still sharp. He just doesn't want to be found." Deborah stood abruptly, gathering her belongings. "Take me to him. Now." The retirement home was a sprawling brick building nestled among pine trees, 2 hours north of Asheville. By the time they arrived, late afternoon shadows stretched across the manicured lawn. A nun in a traditional habit greeted them at the reception desk, her expression instantly suspicious when Torres identified herself as a journalist. "Father Mackenzie doesn't speak to the press," she said firmly. "Doctor's orders." "Please." Deborah stepped forward, her voice breaking. "I'm not press. I'm a mother whose children disappeared 20 years ago. Father Mackenzie was at the hospital that night. He might be the only person who knows what really happened. The nun's stern expression softened slightly. Wait here. She disappeared down a corridor, returning several minutes later with a reluctant nod. 10 minutes, no recording devices. Father Mackenzie sat in a wheelchair by a window overlooking the garden, his thin frame draped in a plaid blanket despite the warmth of the day. At 87, his once robust build had withered, but his blue eyes remained startlingly alert in his wrinkled face. Father Mackenzie, Deborah began, taking a seat across from him. I'm Deborah Matthews. My twin daughters disappeared from St. Mary's Children's Hospital in September 1983. The old priest's hands tightened visibly on his armrests. I remember, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. The blonde girls, Sarah and Claire. Deborah's breath caught. He remembered their names after all these years. I need to know what happened to them, she said, leaning forward. Please. After 20 years, don't I deserve the truth? Mackenzie's gaze drifted to the window, to the distant mountains. I've prayed for forgiveness every day, he murmured. But some sins cannot be absolved so easily. What sins, Father? Torres pressed gently. What did you see? The priest's eyes suddenly focused on Deborah with unexpected intensity. Your daughters were not ill that night, were they? The one you brought in, Emily, she had seizures, but the others were perfectly healthy. Yes, Deborah confirmed, confused. Emily had a high fever and seizures. Sarah and Claire were fine. Mackenzie nodded as if confirming something to himself. They weren't just taking the sick children, he said so quietly they had to lean in to hear him. They were selecting the special ones, the ones with potential. A chill ran down Deborah's spine. What do you mean, selecting? The priest's hands began to tremble. I shouldn't have kept silent, but they threatened to expose my past. Indiscretions. I was weak. His voice cracked with emotion. I saw things in that hospital. Children who disappeared in the night. Records altered or destroyed, and always the same doctors involved. Dr. Hoffman? Deborah asked. Mackenzie's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, Hoffman. And Brenner. And that woman from Washington who came every few months to examine the children. His gaze suddenly darted to the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Your daughters weren't the only ones, Ms. Matthews, but they were special, identical triplets. Do you know how rare that is? How valuable for their studies? Studies? Torres interjected. What studies? But the priest had retreated into himself, his momentary clarity fading. Your girls weren't sick, he repeated, now looking through Deborah rather than at her. They were being chosen. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Father Mackenzie needs his medication now, she announced firmly. Wait, Deborah pleaded, gripping the old man's wrist. Please, tell me where they took my daughters. For a moment, Mackenzie's eyes cleared again, focusing on her face with sudden recognition. I don't know where they are now, he whispered, but they separated them. That was part of it. Separating the identical ones to see how they developed apart. As the nurse wheeled him away, he called back over his shoulder. Check the adoption records in New York. That's where the special ones went. In the car driving back to Asheville, Deborah sat in stunned silence while Torres made rapid notes. It sounds like some kind of study on separated twins, the journalist mused. There were several famous cases in the 60s and 70s where researchers deliberately separated identical siblings to study nature versus nurture. But Deborah barely heard her. A single thought consumed her mind. Her daughters might still be alive, living separate lives, never knowing they were triplets, never knowing their real mother was still searching for them. And someone had orchestrated it all, stolen her children not on a criminal whim, but as part of a calculated scientific plan. We need to find Dr. Brenner, she said suddenly, and these adoption records. If my girls are out there, I'm going to find them. For the first time in 20 years, the crushing weight of grief had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. Rain pelted the windows of Deborah's small kitchen, matching her turbulent mood as she paced back and forth across the worn linoleum floor. A week had passed since her visit to Father Mackenzie, and the investigation seemed to have hit a wall. Dr. Brenner had died in 1999, leaving no records that connected him to any twin studies. The New York adoption agencies they'd contacted refused to release information without court orders. Even Detective Wilson's attempts to use official channels had been met with bureaucratic resistance. Someone's blocking us at every turn, Torres said, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad covered in crossed-out leads. The young journalist had practically moved into Deborah's house, turning the kitchen table into an improvised investigation headquarters. It's like these children were never officially adopted. Deborah rubbed her temples, fighting a growing headache. If it wasn't official adoption, then what was it? Black market? Human trafficking? Maybe something in between, Torres mused. Legal on the surface, but deeply unethical underneath. The kind of operation that powerful people would want to keep hidden. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the tension. Deborah grabbed it on the second ring, her heart racing with the irrational hope that had begun to plague her since Mackenzie's revelation. Matthews' residence. Ms. Matthews. Detective Wilson's voice sounded strained. Are you alone? Deborah glanced at Torres. No. Melissa's here with me. What's happened? I need you both to come to the station. Now. Use the back entrance and don't talk to anyone on your way in. James, you're scaring me. What's going on? A pause. Something's come up. It's better if we discuss it in person. 20 minutes later, Deborah and Torres were ushered into a small conference room at the Asheville Police Department. Wilson looked like he hadn't slept in days. His tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. Beside him sat a middle-aged woman Deborah didn't recognize, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. This is Special Agent Catherine Reeves, FBI. Wilson introduced her. She's been running a parallel investigation into St. Mary's and several other hospitals across the country. Reeves nodded briskly. Ms. Matthews, we believe your daughter's case may be connected to a larger pattern of child disappearances in the late 70s and early 80s. Children with specific characteristics, twins, triplets, children with unusual cognitive abilities, who vanished from hospitals or medical centers under suspicious circumstances. Deborah's mouth went dry. Father Mackenzie mentioned studies, some kind of research on separated twins. Yes, Reeves confirmed. We've been tracking what appears to be an unauthorized research project that operated under the guise of a legitimate adoption initiative. The subjects were primarily identical multiples, separated at birth or in early childhood and placed with families of varying socioeconomic backgrounds. Subjects, Deborah repeated bitterly. You mean children? My children. Reeves had the grace to look momentarily chastened. I apologize for the clinical language. Yes, your daughters and dozens of other children appear to have been targeted for this study. The program operated with private funding and possibly limited government knowledge, though that aspect remains unclear. Torres leaned forward. What happened to these children? Where did they end up? Most were placed with wealthy families through an exclusive New York adoption agency called New Beginnings. The agency closed in 1991, and most of its records were allegedly destroyed. But we've been reconstructing their operations through other means. Wilson slid a manila envelope across the table. This came to the station this morning. No return address, no fingerprints, nothing we can trace. With trembling hands, Deborah opened the envelope. Inside were 3 photographs, slightly faded but unmistakable. 3 teenage girls, identical in their features, walking together across what appeared to be a school campus. They wore preppy uniforms, plaid skirts, white blouses, navy blazers with some kind of crest. Their blonde hair, the same shade Deborah saw every day in her surviving daughter Emily, was styled differently for each girl. One with a short bob, one with shoulder-length waves, one with a tight ponytail. On the back of one photo, in neat handwriting, The Harrington School, 1993. Oh my God, Deborah whispered, her vision blurring with tears. It's them, Sarah and Claire, and Emily. She looked up in confusion. But Emily was with me. She never went to this school. We believe the study occasionally arranged for the separated siblings to cross paths without knowing their connection, Reeves explained, to observe how they interacted as strangers. That's monstrous, Torres breathed. There's more, Wilson said quietly, nodding at the envelope. Beneath the photos was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. They grew up, but they don't know who you are. The words struck Deborah like a physical blow. Her daughters were alive, or had been 10 years ago, but they had no idea who she was. They had grown up calling other women mother. Who sent this? She demanded, her voice cracking. Who's been watching my children all these years? We don't know, Reeves admitted, but it suggests someone involved with the study is having second thoughts. A whistleblower, perhaps. Deborah stared at the photos, drinking in the sight of her lost daughters as teenagers. They would be 26 now. Women with lives and careers and maybe even families of their own. Did they know they were adopted? Did they ever feel that someone, was missing? The Harrington School, she said, focusing on the one concrete lead. Where is it? It was an exclusive prep school on Long Island, Torres replied, already typing notes into her phone. Closed in 2000 after a financial scandal, but its alumni records should still exist somewhere. We need to be careful, Reeves cautioned. If your daughters were placed with influential families, there could be powerful people who want to keep their origins hidden. And we still don't know who sent these photos, or why they chose to do so now. Deborah wasn't listening. Her focus had narrowed to a single burning purpose. I need to find them, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. I don't care who tries to stop me. Wilson exchanged a glance with Reeves. Ms. Matthews, I understand how you feel, but… No, you don't, Deborah interrupted, a steel edge entering her voice. For 20 years I've lived with not knowing, with people whispering that I was somehow responsible, with my surviving daughter growing up under the shadow of her sister's disappearance. Now I find out they were taken as part of some cruel experiment, that they grew up without knowing each other, without knowing me. She slammed her palm on the table. I will find my daughters, and then I will find the people who took them from me. After a long silence, Reeves nodded. We can help you, discreetly. The Bureau has resources that might locate your daughters without tipping off whoever's been monitoring them all these years. She slid a business card across the table. Call this number tomorrow. My colleague will arrange for you to come to our field office in Charlotte. As they left the police station, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets gleaming under the streetlights. Torres touched Deborah's arm gently. What are you going to do now? Deborah clutched the envelope containing the photos. I'm going to call Emily. My surviving daughter deserves to know her sisters might be out there. She paused, gazing up at the night sky where a few stars had begun to appear between the clouds. And then I'm going to New York. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm going to find my children. For the first time in 2 decades, Deborah felt something like purpose flooding her veins. The weight of uncertainty had been replaced by determination. Somewhere out there, her daughters were living lives that had been stolen from them, from all of them. And nothing would stop her from finding them now. Manhattan in October was nothing like Deborah had imagined. The towering buildings seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds, creating artificial canyons that channeled the wind into bitter gusts. Pedestrians hurried past with practiced indifference, their faces set in the blank expressions of people determined to reach their destinations without acknowledging the humanity surging around them. Deborah stood on the sidewalk outside the Plaza Hotel, feeling woefully out of place in her department store blazer and sensible shoes. The FBI had arranged her accommodations, a gesture that still bewildered her, insisting that she maintain the appearance of a tourist rather than a mother on a desperate search. Ms. Matthews, a slender woman with copper-red hair, approached, dressed in the kind of casual elegance that cost more than Deborah earned in a month at the laundromat. I'm Agent Lisa Donovan. We spoke on the phone. Donovan led Deborah through the hotel's opulent lobby to a suite on the 12th floor, where maps and photographs covered one wall, and 3 laptops hummed on a glass conference table. Agent Reeves was already there, along with a stern-faced man introduced only as Thompson. We've located 2 of your daughters, Reeves announced without preamble, gesturing to the wall of photographs. Or rather, the women they've become. Deborah's heart seemed to stop, then race forward at double speed. She approached the wall slowly, her eyes drawn to a surveillance photo of a young woman leaving an office building. Blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun, designer suit, briefcase in hand. But the face, those eyes, unmistakably her daughter. Claire, she whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. Actually, she goes by Catherine now, Thompson corrected. Catherine Blackwell, 26 years old, graduated from Princeton with honors, now a junior executive at Meridian Financial Group, lives in a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side. Deborah couldn't tear her eyes from the image. Claire, Catherine, looked so poised, so successful, so utterly different from the life she might have had in Asheville. Would she have thrived this way if she'd grown up with Deborah, in their modest home, attending public school? And Sarah? She asked, scanning the other photographs. Reeves pointed to another image, a candid shot of a young woman in Central Park, throwing a frisbee to a golden retriever. The same face, but with laughter lines around her eyes. her blonde hair cut into a casual bob. "This is Sarah, now known as Elizabeth Richards. Works as a veterinarian in a private practice in Brooklyn. Married last year to Michael Chen, a pediatrician." Married? Deborah hadn't even considered that possibility. Her little girl, a married woman with a different name, a different history, a different mother who had watched her walk down the aisle. "What about their adoptive families?" she asked, her mouth dry. "The Blackwells are old money, banking, real estate, political connections. They adopted Catherine through New Beginnings in 1984, shortly after your daughters disappeared. The official story was that she was the orphaned daughter of a distant family connection." Thompson picked up the narrative. "The Richards family is upper middle class. Father's a surgeon, mother's a former concert pianist. They also adopted through New Beginnings, but were apparently told Elizabeth's biological mother was a teenager who couldn't care for her." Deborah struggled to process this information. "Do they know they're adopted?" "Catherine doesn't appear to," Donovan said. "The Blackwells never told her. Elizabeth does know she's adopted, but has never searched for her biological family. As far as we can tell, neither of them knows about their triplet status. And neither knows about Emily," Deborah concluded, thinking of her surviving daughter who had reluctantly agreed to fly in from Seattle tomorrow. The reunion she had imagined for so many years was finally within reach, yet now that it was here, fear gnawed at her confidence. What if they rejected her? "There's something else you should know," Reeves said carefully. "About the third twin." Deborah looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Sarah and Claire are both accounted for." A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Reeves slid a newspaper clipping across the table. The headline read, "Harrington School Alumna Dies in Sailing Accident." Below was a photograph of a young woman with the same face as Catherine and Elizabeth, but this wasn't one of the missing twins. "This is Emily," Deborah whispered, staring at the photo in horror. "My Emily." "No," Thompson said quietly. "This is Abigail Harrington, adopted by Senator William Harrington and his wife in 1984. She died in a boating accident off Martha's Vineyard in 1999. She was 19. Deborah shook her head violently. "That's impossible. Emily has been with me all these years. She's flying in tomorrow." The three agents exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Donovan placed a hand on Deborah's shoulder. "Ms. Matthews, we believe there weren't just 3 identical girls born to you in 1977. There were 4. The world seemed to tilt beneath Deborah's feet. 4? "No, that's not. The doctor said triplets. 3 identical girls. We've reviewed your original prenatal records," Reeves explained gently. "There's a notation about a possible 4th heartbeat detected at your 5-month checkup, but it was dismissed as an echo. We believe you had identical quadruplets, Ms. Matthews. 3 were taken that night at the hospital. Emily remained with you. Quadruplets." The word echoed in Deborah's mind like a foreign language. 4 identical daughters, not 3. It wasn't possible. And yet, hadn't the nurses always commented on how unusually large she was during pregnancy? Hadn't the delivery been exceptionally difficult? "Abigail Harrington was part of the study too," Thompson continued. "The ultimate control subject, a quadruplet raised by the wealthiest family, with every advantage." "And she died," Deborah whispered. Grief for a daughter she never knew stabbing through her chest. She died without knowing who she really was. "I'm sorry," Donovan said softly. "Her death may be what prompted our whistleblower to reach out now. Someone involved in the study might have developed a conscience after seeing one of the girls die so young." Deborah stood abruptly, needing to move, to breathe. She walked to the window overlooking Central Park, its autumn colors a blur through her tears. "I want to see them, Catherine and Elizabeth. Today." "Ms. Matthews," Reeves began cautiously, "we should prepare carefully for that meeting. These women have built entire lives on foundations that your appearance will completely destabilize." "I've waited 20 years, Deborah said, her voice breaking. "I won't wait another day." 3 hours later, Deborah sat in a sleek leather chair in Catherine Blackwell's corner office at Meridian Financial, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it was visible through her blouse. Agent Donovan had arranged the meeting under the pretense of discussing a potential investment, ensuring Catherine's assistant would leave them undisturbed. When the door opened and Catherine walked in, Claire, now a polished Manhattan executive, Deborah nearly collapsed. The young woman extended her hand professionally, her smile courteous but reserved. "Ms. Matthews, is it? How can I help you today? The carefully rehearsed speech vanished from Deborah's mind. All she could do was stare at this beautiful stranger who had her daughter's face, her daughter's eyes, but none of her daughter's memories. I'm sorry, Deborah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. This is harder than I expected. Catherine's expression shifted from professional courtesy to confusion. I'm sorry, have we met before? No, Deborah said, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her best efforts. But we should have. I'm your mother, Claire. Your biological mother. The transformation in Catherine's face was immediate. Shock, disbelief, then a flash of anger. I think you've made a mistake. My name is Catherine, not Claire, and my parents are Richard and Eleanor Blackwell. You were born Claire Matthews, Deborah pressed on, pulling out the photographs of the 3 teenage girls at the Harrington School. You have 2 identical sisters, triplets. You were taken from me when you were 6 years old, at St. Mary's Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. Catherine stared at the photographs, her professional composure crumbling. This is some kind of sick joke. Security, she called, reaching for her desk phone. Please, Deborah begged. Just look at the pictures. That's you in the middle. Those are your sisters. You were part of a study and experiment on separated identical siblings. You deserve to know the truth. Get out, Catherine said, her voice ice cold. Before I have you arrested for harassment. The meeting with Elizabeth Richards went no better. In her cozy veterinary office in Brooklyn, surrounded by photos of pets she had treated, Elizabeth listened to Deborah's story with more patience, but equal disbelief. My mother died 3 years ago, she said finally, her eyes brimming with tears. Margaret Richards. She was the woman who raised me, who loved me, who supported me through every challenge in my life. I'm sorry for whatever you've been through, Ms. Matthews, but I can't be who you want me to be. When Elizabeth handed back the photographs, her hand briefly touched Deborah's. The contact, the first touch between mother and daughter in 20 years, sent a jolt through Deborah's body, but Elizabeth's expression remained resolute. Please don't contact me again, she said gently but firmly. I have a life, a husband, a family that I love. I don't need my world turned upside down by a stranger's claims. That night, alone in her hotel suite, Deborah sat on the bathroom floor, sobbing like she hadn't since those first terrible days after the twins disappeared. Her daughters were alive, successful, loved, and completely lost to her. The truth she had fought so hard to uncover had only brought new pain, new loss. When the hotel phone rang, she almost didn't answer it, but a small flame of hope still flickered, impossible to extinguish completely. Hello? Ms. Matthews? Elizabeth's voice tentative and strained. I've been thinking about what you said, about the hospital in North Carolina and the twin study. A pause. I'd like to meet again tomorrow, with my husband. He's a doctor, and he has questions about the medical aspects of your story. Deborah closed her eyes, tears of gratitude spilling down her cheeks. Yes, of course. Anytime. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't reunion, but it was a tiny crack in the wall of disbelief, a small ray of light in what had felt like the darkest moment of her 20-year journey. The late October sky hung low and gray over Asheville, as Deborah's taxi wound its way up the mountain road toward the demolition site that had once been St. Mary's Children's Hospital. 2 weeks had passed since her devastating trip to New York. 2 weeks of profound emotional whiplash that had left her hollowed out, yet somehow still standing. Emily had flown in from Seattle as promised, her arrival at the Manhattan hotel suite creating a moment of surreal juxtaposition. Here was the daughter Deborah had raised, the same blonde hair, the same blue eyes as the women she'd met in New York, yet so different in her mannerisms, her style, her very essence. Nature versus nurture playing out in flesh and blood. Mom, Emily had said, embracing Deborah tentatively. Their relationship had been strained for years, fractured by the weight of what had happened and what hadn't been said. Agent Reeves told me everything. About Sarah and Claire. About the 4th baby. They had cried together then, really cried for the first time since Emily was a teenager. For the sisters lost. For the one who had died without knowing her true identity. For the 20 years of whispered blame and unspoken accusations between mother and surviving daughter. The meeting with Elizabeth and her husband Michael had gone better than Deborah dared hope. The young pediatrician had listened to Deborah's story with professional interest, asking detailed questions about the hospital, the alleged study, the medical implications of separating identical siblings. When Deborah showed them the DNA test results the FBI had discreetly obtained, confirming beyond doubt that Emily, Elizabeth, and Catherine were identical siblings, something had shifted in Elizabeth's expression. "I always felt like something was missing," she'd admitted, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Even knowing I was adopted, it was more than that. Like a phantom limb feeling, but deeper." Catherine had been harder to convince. The Wall Street executive had initially refused further contact, going so far as to file a restraining order against Deborah. It was only when Emily had reached out directly, one sister to another, that Catherine had reluctantly agreed to meet. The four women had gathered in a private room at a neutral Manhattan restaurant. Mother and three daughters, strangers connected by blood and separated by decades of lies. The resemblance between the sisters was uncanny, yet their differences were equally striking. Catherine's rigid posture and carefully controlled expressions, Elizabeth's warm, open face and casual confidence, Emily's nervous energy and watchful eyes. Three versions of the same genetic blueprint, shaped by radically different environments. "I had the Blackwells investigated," Catherine had announced coldly, placing a folder on the table. "They knew. They've known all along what happened at St. Mary's. My father, Richard, was on the board of directors for the foundation that funded the twin studies. The revelation had stunned them all. Catherine's adoptive parents hadn't merely accepted a child through questionable channels. They had been active participants in the separation of the siblings. In that moment, something had broken in Catherine's perfect facade, a crack in the foundation of her identity. "They told me my birth mother was a drug addict who didn't want me," she'd whispered, her voice raw with betrayal. "They told me I was lucky to be rescued." Now, as Deborah stepped out of the taxi at the demolished hospital site, those conversations echoed in her mind. The FBI investigation was progressing rapidly, following money trails and institutional connections that linked St. Mary's to similar operations at hospitals across the country. Several former doctors and administrators had been brought in for questioning. The full scope of the twin study was still emerging, but one thing was clear. Powerful people had orchestrated the theft of children for decades, all in the name of scientific research. The demolition was complete now. Where the imposing brick building had once stood, there was only bare earth, construction equipment, and stacks of salvaged materials. The site was deserted on this Sunday morning, the chain-link fence surrounding it unlocked and swinging open in the mountain breeze, an invitation Deborah couldn't resist. She walked slowly across the muddy ground, orienting herself by memory. Here had been the emergency entrance where she'd rushed in with Emily that night. There, the waiting area where Sarah and Claire had sat on the wooden bench, and somewhere beneath her feet, the underground spaces where a janitor had heard children crying. From her pocket, she withdrew the small pink bracelet, Claire's bracelet that Detective Wilson had released to her after the forensic testing was complete. The small heart charm caught the weak sunlight, the engraved words still visible. "Mommy, don't cry." Deborah knelt in the dirt, not caring about her clothes, and placed the bracelet gently on a flat piece of concrete that had once been part of the hospital foundation. "I never left you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. "They took you from me." The past few weeks had brought answers, but no real closure. Catherine had cut off contact with her adoptive parents, the betrayal too fresh and deep to navigate. Elizabeth was cautiously building a relationship with Emily, the two sisters exchanging daily text messages as they discovered their shared traits and divergent tastes. Both women remained distant with Deborah, polite but guarded, acknowledging her as their biological mother but unable to embrace her as mom. And the fourth daughter, Abigail, the one Deborah had never known existed, remained a ghost, known only through photographs and newspaper clippings of her short life. Senator Harrington had refused all contact, his lawyers issuing cold statements denying any knowledge of improper adoption practices. "I missed everything," Deborah said to the empty air, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Your first days of school, your graduations, your wedding," she added, thinking of Elizabeth and her kind-eyed husband, all those moments that should have been ours. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the barren ground. Deborah stood, brushing dirt from her knees, feeling the weight of both knowledge and loss. The truth had not set her free, as she'd hoped during those desperate years of searching. Instead, it had revealed new prisons, the pain of knowing her daughters had grown up calling other women mother, The agony of meeting them as grown women with no shared memories, no foundation of love to build upon. The terrible knowledge that one daughter had lived and died never knowing her true identity. Yet something had shifted inside her. The crushing weight of uncertainty was gone, replaced by a different burden, but one she could carry. Her daughters were alive. The truth, painful as it was, had been dragged into the light after decades of darkness. As she turned to leave, Deborah noticed a figure standing by the fence, Detective Wilson, his hands in his pockets, watching her with quiet respect. "I thought I might find you here," he said as she approached. "How are you holding up?" Deborah considered the question, letting the mountain air fill her lungs. "I'm standing," she said finally. "That's something." Wilson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is convening a grand jury next month. They'll want your testimony." "I'll be ready," Deborah promised. The people who had orchestrated the theft of her daughters would face justice, even if that justice came 2 decades too late. They walked together toward his car, leaving behind the ruins of St. Mary's and all it represented. Ahead lay uncertainty, the difficult path of trying to build relationships with daughters who were strangers, the public scrutiny as the case made headlines, the painful process of testimony and trials. But for the first time in 20 years, Deborah walked with her head high, unburdened by the weight of not knowing. The truth had not healed her wounds, but it had validated them. Her daughters had not vanished because of her negligence or some cruel twist of fate. They had been taken by people who saw them not as beloved children but as research subjects. "They grew up, but they don't know who you are," the anonymous note had taunted. Perhaps they never truly would. Perhaps the bonds that should have formed in childhood were impossible to forge in adulthood. But they knew now, and so did she. It wasn't the ending Deborah had dreamed of during those long, lonely years. There was no joyful reunion, no seamless reweaving of severed family ties. But there was truth. There was justice on the horizon. And there was perhaps the beginning of something new. Not the mother-daughter relationships that had been stolen, but connections between adults who shared blood and loss, and the tentative hope of building something from the ashes of what might have been. As Deborah looked back one last time at the empty space where her world had shattered 20 years ago, she whispered a final promise to all 4 of her daughters. "I never left you, and I never will." Deborah Matthews's 20-year journey reminds us that truth can be both a healer and a destroyer. When her daughters vanished that fateful night in 1983, she lost not just her children, but her identity as their mother. Yet through decades of uncertainty, judgment, and heartbreak, she never stopped searching, even when finding answers meant facing a reality more painful than the questions. What would you do if discovering the truth meant shattering the very foundation of your children's lives? Would you pursue justice at the cost of their happiness? Or would you, like Deborah, understand that love sometimes means standing in the ruins of what might have been, accepting that some bonds once broken cannot be perfectly restored? The story of the Matthews family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about identity, belonging, and the institutions we trust. 4 identical girls, separated by calculated design rather than chance, growing into 4 different women, living proof that who we become is shaped not just by our DNA, but by the hands that guide us, the environments that mold us, and the stories we're told about ourselves. If you discovered your entire life was built on deliberate deception, how would you reconcile who you thought you were with who you were meant to be? This isn't just a story about missing children. It's about the missing pieces within all of us, the questions of origin and belonging that haunt even those who've never been physically lost. In Deborah's unyielding quest for her daughters, we see the purest form of a mother's love. Not possessive, not controlling, but persistent in its demand for truth, even when that truth offers no happy ending. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling human stories that challenge us to look deeper at the world around us. Comment below what you would have done in Deborah's position. Would you have kept searching or accepted that some losses cannot be undone? Until next time, remember that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to face the truth, however devastating it may be.